The night in New York had its own music. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded into the hum of the city. Street lamps cast long shadows across cobblestone alleys, and in those shadows walked a man whose name carried the weight of fear, Vito Genovese. He was a man who had everything a gangster could want: power, respect, wealth beyond measure. Yet when history remembers him, it does not speak of him as a king who ruled wisely, but as a don who betrayed his own family, a man whose rise and fall became a dark cautionary tale. Imagine a smoky bar on Mulberry Street in the 1930s. The clink of whiskey glasses, the quiet murmur of conversations where every word mattered. Behind closed doors, deals were struck that would shape the city, perhaps even the country. In one corner, Vito sat, his expression calm, almost unreadable. His dark eyes seemed to calculate everything, weighing advantage against risk, loyalty against ambition. He did not speak often, but when he did, men listened. There was an aura about him, part mystery, part menace, as if he already knew the end of the story. This is not just the story of a gangster. It is the story of a man who climbed to the top of the most dangerous criminal organization in America, only to watch it all slip away because of his own decisions. His life was a chain of choices, some brilliant, some catastrophic. And with every choice, he left behind a trail of blood, betrayal, and unanswered questions. There is a reason the name Vito Genovese still echoes in the halls of organized crime history. He was not just another mob boss, he was a master strategist, a man who saw the mafia not as a collection of neighborhood gangs but as a true empire, one that could be run with precision, profit, and brutal efficiency. He helped shape the very commission that would rule over the American underworld, turning chaos into order. And yet, for all his genius, it was his inability to trust, his hunger for power, and his betrayal of allies that led to his downfall. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this world as it was back then. New York in the 1930s was a place of contrasts. Elegant nightclubs glittered with chandeliers while just blocks away, families crowded into tenement apartments. The Great Depression had left many desperate, and in that desperation, men like Vito found opportunity. He learned early that fear was a kind of currency, and he spent it wisely. Each move he made was deliberate, each step forward planned as if on a chessboard where lives were the pieces. But every great story begins with a question, and this one begins with many. How did a boy from the back streets of Naples become one of the most feared men in America? How did he gain the trust of Lucky Luciano, the man who restructured the mafia into the powerhouse it became? And most importantly, how did he go from being trusted right-hand man to the man whose ambition would send shockwaves through the very family he helped build? Tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow and let the weight of the day slip away, we will walk through the decades of Vito's life together. We will explore the alleys where he first learned the meaning of power, sit in the rooms where plans for murders were whispered, and follow him to Italy, where he fled from justice only to become even more dangerous. We will watch him return to New York, reclaim his place, and rise to the position he had always dreamed of, boss of bosses. And then, we will see it all begin to unravel. Because power has a price. And for Vito, that price was betrayal he dealt out, and betrayal that came back to him. His story reminds us that the higher you climb, the lonelier the air becomes, and the more enemies wait for you to fall. The streets remember men like Vito Genovese. Even now, decades later, there are whispers of the deals he made, the blood that was spilled, and the legacy he left behind. Some remember him as a visionary, a man who turned the mafia into a true institution. Others remember him as reckless, a man whose hunger for more brought too much attention, too much heat, and nearly destroyed what he helped build. As you listen to this story, let the rhythm of history guide you gently. The sounds of the city will fade, replaced by the slow, measured unfolding of a life lived in shadows. Each chapter will bring you closer to understanding the man behind the name and perhaps, in some quiet way, closer to understanding why stories like this still hold such power over us. And so, our story begins here, in the dim light of a world where loyalty was everything and betrayal could end your life before the next sunrise. The tale of Vito Genovese is not just a story about crime, it is a story about ambition, fear, and the human need to control one's destiny, no matter the cost. Settle in. Let the story carry you. What happened next would shock even his allies. Before Vito Genovese became the Don whose name would be feared across New York, he was just a boy. His story begins not in America, but on the narrow, sun-baked streets of Naples, Italy. Imagine the smell of the Mediterranean air, the sound of church bells ringing from a distant cathedral, and the clatter of horse-drawn carts carrying goods through the marketplace. Life was not easy here. Naples in the late 19th and early 20th century was a place where survival meant knowing how to navigate hardship. Poverty was a constant shadow over every family. Vito was born in 1897, in a world that gave him little choice but to be tough. He was one of many children, and the Genovese household was cramped, filled with the noise of siblings, the aroma of simple meals cooked over small fires, and the constant pressure of making ends meet. His father worked when he could. His mother kept the home together with quiet determination, but there was never enough. Naples was a city of contrasts, beautiful on the surface with its coastal views and vibrant culture, but also hard and unforgiving if you were poor. For young Vito, the streets became his classroom. He learned early that life was about taking what you could, holding on to what was yours, and never showing weakness. He watched men fight over scraps, saw neighbors argue over debts, and heard whispers about men who operated outside the law, men who seemed to have more money, more respect, and more control over their destiny than anyone else. Those men fascinated him. When the Genovese family made the decision to emigrate to America, it was out of both desperation and hope. America was the land of opportunity, a place where even the poor could reinvent themselves. Vito was still a child when they boarded the ship that would take them across the Atlantic, leaving behind the familiar chaos of Naples for the unknown chaos of New York City. The journey was long and crowded. Steerage class was cramped, noisy, and filled with the smells of hundreds of families packed together. Vito spent those days watching the waves, imagining the life that awaited him. Would America be the shining dream people spoke of? Or would it simply be another place where survival was a daily struggle? When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty must have been both awe-inspiring and intimidating. The Genovese family passed through Ellis Island like millions of other immigrants, their names recorded, their belongings inspected, their future uncertain. They were now part of the great Italian-American wave that would reshape the city's neighborhoods. Their new life began in the crowded tenements of Lower Manhattan, where entire families crammed into single rooms, sharing hallways, bathrooms, and the thick smell of coal smoke. The streets outside were alive with pushcarts selling fruit, fish, and bread. Children ran barefoot, playing stickball, while mothers called them in for dinner. It was loud, chaotic, and full of life, but it was also a place where crime was never far away. For Vito, the adjustment was swift. The boy who had learned to survive in Naples now learned to survive in New York. English came slowly, but he picked up the language of the streets faster, the unspoken rules, the alliances, the rivalries. He watched as older boys ran errands for local gangsters, carrying messages, collecting payments. The gangsters themselves fascinated him: sharp suits, polished shoes, the kind of confidence that made people step aside when they walked by. At night, Vito would hear arguments from neighbors about rent, hear police whistles blowing in the distance, and sometimes the unmistakable sound of a fist fight or a broken bottle. New York could be dangerous, but for someone like Vito, that danger was an opportunity. He was quick to learn that respect was earned not just with words, but with action. School was never Vito's main focus. Like many immigrant children of the time, he left formal education early to work and help support the family. This gave him more time on the streets, more time to meet the kinds of men who would shape his future. He became known as a boy who could handle himself, a boy who didn't shy away from trouble. The Mafia was not yet the highly organized institution it would become. It was still made up of loose gangs, neighborhood crews, each with its own boss. But even then, its power could be felt. If you were connected, you could get work, you could get protection, you could get revenge if someone wronged you. For a young man with ambition, the Mafia offered something that ordinary life did not: a way to rise. By his teenage years, Vito was already involved in petty crime, small thefts, running errands, maybe even carrying a weapon when asked. He learned who to trust and who to avoid. He saw what happened to men who crossed the wrong people, and he never forgot those lessons. All of this formed the foundation of the man he would become. The poverty of Naples had made him tough. The streets of New York made him ambitious. Each experience was like a brick, building the persona that would one day command one of the most powerful crime families in America. And even then, even as just another boy on Mulberry Street, there must have been something in Vito's eyes that set him apart, something colder, sharper, a sense that he would not be satisfied with just scraping by. He wanted more. More respect, more control, more power. As night settled over the tenements, as lamps were turned down, and the city quieted, Vito might have stared out of a window at the glow of distant lights and wondered how far he could go. He was still young, but the path had already begun to reveal itself. He was no ordinary boy. He was destined for something darker, something bigger. What happened next would draw him deeper into a world where violence and loyalty walked hand in hand. The boy from Naples was about to become a man, and his education in the ways of the underworld had only just begun. By the time Vito reached his late teens, the streets of New York had already claimed him. He was no longer just an immigrant boy trying to survive. He was a young man who had learned that power came to those who were willing to take risks. The city was roaring through the 1910s, and 1920s, and organized crime was evolving alongside it. Prohibition would soon transform bootleggers into millionaires, and for ambitious young men like Vito, the underworld offered a path that ordinary work never could. Picture the Lower East Side during these years: dim alleys lit by gas lamps, speaky sighs hidden behind unmarked doors, and the constant buzz of opportunity for those bold enough to reach for it. Vito's world was filled with men who were carving out their territories, fighting over control of gambling dens, protection rackets, and smuggling routes. These were not petty thieves. They were businessmen of the shadows, violent, yes, but strategic. And Vito was watching, learning, waiting for his chance. He started small, as most did. Running errands for local crews, passing messages, standing watch during illicit deals. He was quiet, reliable, and, most importantly, fearless. Fear was a weakness that had no place in this world, and Vito showed early on that he did not flinch. When tempers flared and fists flew, he held his ground. When a man needed to be found, a debt collected, or a warning delivered, young Vito was the one who got it done. This was an apprenticeship of sorts, not in a school, but on the streets. Every day brought lessons: who to respect, who to challenge, when to strike first, and when to wait. It wasn't long before older men began to notice him. Among them was Charles Lucky Luciano, a figure who would become central to Vito's life. Luciano, himself a visionary, was beginning to see that the old ways of running the mafia, divided, chaotic, steeped in endless vendettas, were holding everyone back. He was planning something bigger, a streamlined, businesslike approach to organized crime that could make fortunes and reduce unnecessary bloodshed. For someone like Vito, who craved power and respected efficiency, Luciano's vision must have seemed like destiny calling. Slowly, carefully, Vito was brought closer to Luciano's circle. He was still a small player then, but he had something rare, a combination of loyalty, intelligence, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. The Prohibition era was a turning point. When the Volstead Act banned alcohol in 1920, the United States unintentionally handed organized crime its golden ticket. Illegal liquor became one of the most profitable businesses imaginable, and men like Luciano and his allies seized the opportunity. Vito, now fully entrenched, played his part in the bootlegging operations. Trucks had to be loaded, shipments protected, rival crews kept at bay. Violence was inevitable, and Vito proved himself capable not just of planning but of action. There are stories, some whispered, some recorded, of Vito's first real acts of violence during this period. He learned quickly that in the mafia, a man's reputation was everything. A single hesitation could mark you as weak, and weakness could get you killed. Vito did not hesitate. Whether it was a beating delivered to a rival, a debt collected with threats, or even a killing ordered by someone above him, he carried it out without complaint. Each act hardened him, each success earned him greater trust. But the streets had their risks. Vito had his first brushes with the law during these years. Arrests for minor offenses, weapons possession, perhaps assault, the kind of charges that were almost a badge of honor for a young gangster. Jail time was short, often avoided through connections or bribes, but these encounters with the police taught Vito something valuable: how to keep his mouth shut. In a world where everyone wanted information, silence was a man's best defense. Slowly, Vito was developing a reputation. He was not as flashy as some gangsters, not as loud or flamboyant. He preferred to stay in the background, to watch and calculate. This made him dangerous. The quiet ones always were. People began to realize that when Vito spoke, it meant something. When he made a promise, he kept it. And when he made a threat, it was never empty. By the mid-1920s, Vito was no longer a boy running errands. He was an enforcer, a trusted soldier in Luciano's organization. He handled business with a cold precision that impressed his superiors. He was also becoming wealthy, not ostentatiously so, but enough to move his family into a better place, to dress sharply, to live with a quiet pride. Money, for Vito, was not about showing off, it was about security and influence. And yet, with each step up the ladder, the stakes grew higher. The men around him were not street punks, but power brokers who controlled unions, politicians, and judges. Alliances were fragile, and the wrong move could lead to sudden death. Vito thrived in this environment. He had an instinct for reading people, for knowing who could be trusted and who was plotting behind the scenes. In those years, Vito must have felt that the world was finally opening up to him. Every choice he made seemed to bring him closer to his goal, though what that goal was exactly, even he might not have been able to say. Perhaps it was simply to rise as far as he could, to never again be the poor boy from Naples who had to beg for scraps. But the underworld is never without its storms. Rival gangs fought constantly for control, and even allies sometimes turned into enemies overnight. Each night carried the possibility that a bullet could come from a passing car, that a meeting could turn into an ambush. Vito lived with that risk, and, in a strange way, it must have thrilled him. Power was addictive, and with each year that passed, he wanted more. And so, Vito's transformation from immigrant boy to feared mobster was nearly complete. He had paid his dues, proved his loyalty, and earned a place among men who would soon reshape the mafia into something far greater than neighborhood gangs. But there was one more test coming, one that would require Vito to choose between friendship and ambition, between loyalty and survival. The streets were about to grow bloodier, and Vito's next choices would forever set the course of his life. By the mid-1920s, Vito Genovese had proven himself more than just another soldier on the street. He had become someone who could be trusted with real responsibility. And in the world of organized crime, trust was everything. He was now close to men who were changing the shape of the mafia forever, none more important than Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was brilliant, ruthless, and forward-thinking. He had a vision that went beyond street corners and rackets. He saw organized crime as an empire waiting to be built, and he needed men around him who were willing to make that vision a reality. Vito was one of those men. The old mafia was still run by the so-called mustache Petes, the old-school bosses who insisted on strict Sicilian traditions and refused to work with outsiders. They favored blood feuds over business deals, and they saw the mafia as something that should never change. Luciano and his younger allies, men like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, had a different idea. They wanted to modernize the organization, to focus on profit rather than vendettas, and to build a system that would be more efficient, more powerful, and harder to destroy. Vito fit perfectly into this vision. He was a man who understood discipline and control. He had no problem carrying out orders that would clear the path for Luciano's rise. Together, they worked to expand their rackets, bootlegging operations during Prohibition, gambling rings, loan sharking, and protection schemes. The money flowed in. The streets buzzed with activity. And Vito's role grew more important with each passing month. Imagine the rooms where these plans were made. A dimly lit backroom of an Italian restaurant, the air thick with cigar smoke, the sound of glasses clinking softly on the table. Luciano speaking in calm, measured tones, explaining how they would reorganize the mafia into something bigger than ever before. Around the table sat men who would become legends in their own right, nodding, listening, weighing the risks. And somewhere at that table was Vito, quiet, watchful, absorbing every word. His loyalty was never in question. When Luciano needed muscle, Vito provided it. When someone needed to be eliminated to keep business running smoothly, Vito handled it. He was not loud or boastful about it. He simply got things done, and that made him invaluable. It was during this time that Luciano and his allies orchestrated one of the most pivotal events in Mafia history, the end of the Castellammare War. This bloody conflict had torn through New York's underworld as rival factions fought for control. Luciano, with the support of his closest men, decided that the old bosses had to go if peace and profit were ever to be restored. Vito was right there beside him. The murder of Joe, the boss, Masseria in 1931 was a turning point. Masseria was one of the old guard, and his death signaled that a new era was beginning. Luciano, Vito, and their allies had carefully plotted the hit, and when it was carried out, it cleared the way for Salvatore Marangiano to briefly take over. But Marangiano, too, stood in the way of Luciano's vision. He wanted to crown himself boss of bosses, a title that Luciano knew would only lead to more bloodshed. So Luciano made another decision, one that would forever alter the mafia's structure. Marangiano, too, was eliminated, stabbed to death in his office. And once again, it was Luciano's trusted men, including Vito, who ensured the plan was executed. The deaths of Masseria and Marangiano ended the war and opened the door for something entirely new, the Commission. This was Luciano's brainchild, a governing body that would oversee the mafia nationwide, resolving disputes and making decisions collectively, like a board of directors. It was revolutionary, and it changed organized crime forever. And in this new world, Vito Genovese thrived. He was now more than an enforcer. He was becoming a strategist in his own right, a man who could sit at the table with the top bosses and have his voice heard. He handled business with a calm efficiency, keeping the family's operations running smoothly. His name began to carry real weight. If Vito wanted something done, it got done. If Vito gave an order, it was followed. This period was perhaps the most exciting in Vito's life. The money was better than ever, the power greater than he had ever imagined. He could walk into any club in Little Italy and know that every head would turn, every man would nod in respect. For someone who had come from nothing, who had been a poor boy in Naples dreaming of more, this must have felt like victory. But with great power came new dangers. Luciano's modernization of the mafia had not gone unnoticed by law enforcement, and the government was beginning to pay closer attention. Raids, arrests, and investigations became a constant threat. Vito, ever careful, kept a low profile compared to some of the more flamboyant gangsters of the era. He understood that visibility could be dangerous, and he preferred to work quietly, letting others take the spotlight. And yet, even as Luciano consolidated power, even as the commission was established and the mafia became more powerful than ever, Vito's mind was already turning toward the future. He had been at Luciano's side, he had helped build this empire, but deep down, Vito had his own ambitions. He had tasted power, and he wanted more. As the 1930s moved forward, Vito's role as Luciano's right-hand man placed him closer than ever to the top. But it also placed him in the center of a world where every ally could one day be a rival, and every friend could one day become an obstacle. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life. one where loyalty would be tested and where his own decisions would begin to change the course of mafia history. For now, though, Vito was content to watch, to wait, and to plan. He had risen from the back streets of Naples to the highest circles of power in New York. The dream he had once imagined as a boy was now real. But he was not done climbing. The peak of power was in sight, and Vito Genovese would do whatever it took to reach it. The streets of New York were on fire, not literally, but with tension so thick it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. The Castellammares War, as it would come to be known, had turned the underworld into a battlefield. Two powerful factions were locked in a bloody struggle for control, and every day brought more bodies, more whispers, more fear. For Vito Genovese, this was not just another gang feud. This was the crucible that would forge the future of the mafia, and it was the moment when his loyalty and his ruthlessness would be tested like never before. The war had begun as a clash between Joe, the boss Masseria, who had ruled New York's mafia for years, and Salvatore Marangino, who had come from Sicily determined to take the throne for himself. It was a conflict as old as the mafia itself, the old guard against the new, the Sicilian traditionalists against those who believed organized crime could be something more than endless vendettas. For nearly 2 years, gunfire echoed through the boroughs, and blood flowed in the streets. Vito was firmly in Masseria's camp, as was his mentor, Lucky Luciano. Masseria had given them their start, and loyalty was expected. But as the war dragged on, Luciano and his inner circle, Vito among them, began to see that Masseria was fighting for an old world that was slipping away. His refusal to adapt, his insistence on clinging to outdated traditions, was costing them money and men. For Luciano, this was unacceptable. The future of organized crime depended on ending the war, and that meant ending Masseria's reign. The plan that emerged was as cold as it was brilliant. Luciano would betray Masseria, offering to switch sides and throw his support to Marangino, but only if Marangino agreed to end the war and allow Luciano and his allies a seat at the table. Marangino agreed. And so, a plot was born. Joe Masseria would have to die. It was a risky move, one that could have cost Luciano and his men their lives if discovered. But the plan went forward. On a warm April afternoon in 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tammaro, a restaurant on Coney Island. The atmosphere was calm, almost casual. They ate, they played cards, they talked business. Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom, and that was the signal. The gunmen entered quietly, their faces set, their weapons ready. Among them was Vito Genovese. The air must have felt electric, every second stretching long and heavy. Then the gunfire erupted, sharp cracks that shattered the calm of the room. Masseria barely had time to react before the bullets struck him, his body slumping over the card table, the hand of cards still clutched in his fingers. In a matter of seconds, Joe, the boss, was no more. The message was clear, the old guard had been toppled. With Masseria gone, Marangino took control, and for a short time, there was peace. But Marangino had ambitions of his own, ambitions that made Luciano uneasy. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, a title that gave him ultimate authority over every mafia family. To men like Luciano and Vito, this was dangerous. They had not betrayed Masseria just to trade one tyrant for another. Marangino also began to make moves that suggested he did not fully trust Luciano's group. He hired men, some say Irish hitmen, to eliminate Luciano and his closest allies. But Luciano learned of the plot before it could be carried out. And once again, a plan was set in motion. This time, it would be Marangino who would meet a violent end. On a September day in 1931, 4 men entered Marangino's office on Park Avenue, posing as tax agents. They were not tax agents. They were Luciano's killers. The attack was quick, brutal, and final. Marangino was stabbed multiple times, shot, and left to die on the floor of his office. In that single moment, the old mafia order, ruled by Sicilian bosses, obsessed with tradition, was gone. What followed was something entirely new. Luciano, with the support of men like Vito, Lansky, and Frank Costello, created the Commission, a governing body designed to prevent wars like the one they had just survived. No longer would there be a single boss of bosses. Instead, the families would share power, meeting to resolve disputes and manage territory. It was an elegant solution, one that turned organized crime into a true business, stable and profitable. For Vito Genovese, this was a moment of triumph. He had been there at every critical step, the plotting, the betrayal, the killings. He had proven himself loyal not just to Luciano, but to the new vision of the mafia. And with the war over, with the commission in place, he now stood near the very top of the criminal underworld. But this was also a turning point for Vito personally. If he had once been just a soldier, now he was something more, a man who had helped reshape history. The blood spilled in those years was not forgotten, and Vito knew that every death, every decision, carried a price. Power in the mafia was never free. On quiet nights, when the city had gone still, perhaps Vito thought back to that card game, to the look on Masseria's face, to the silence that followed the gunfire. Perhaps he wondered if there was any going back, any way to return to a simpler life. But deep down, he must have known the truth. There was no going back. He was too far in now, too deeply tied to the empire they had built. The Castellammare War had changed everything. It had killed the old world and given birth to the new. And it had forged Vito Genovese into the man who would one day sit on the throne himself. But the throne he sought would not come easily. Even as peace settled over the mafia, rivalries still simmered beneath the surface. And for Vito, the hunger for more power was growing stronger every day. The blood of the Castellammare War had barely dried when Vito Genovese began to show the traits that would define his legacy. The war was over, the commission was in place, and the mafia was stronger and richer than ever. But for Vito, peace was not enough. Peace meant time to plan, to scheme, and to look for ways to climb higher. He had stood beside Luciano and helped shape this new world, but he was not content to remain in the shadow of any man. Ambition was now the pulse that kept him alive. Vito's first major betrayals began in these years, betrayals that revealed both his cunning and his ruthlessness. Among the most infamous was the murder of Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia, a man who had once been Vito's friend and associate. Boccia was no ordinary hoodlum. He was a man with connections, a man who could be useful. But when Boccia crossed Vito, when he became more of a liability than an asset, the outcome was inevitable. The story goes that Boccia insulted Vito during a card game, humiliating him in front of others. In the mafia, respect was everything. To lose face was to lose power, and Vito would not tolerate that. In 1934, Boccia was lured to a meeting, perhaps believing that tempers had cooled, that the insult had been forgiven. But forgiveness was not Vito's way. Boccia was shot dead, and his body left as a message. No one disrespected Vito Genovese and lived to tell about it. This was not just a personal vendetta, it was a statement of how Vito intended to operate. He was a man who believed that fear was a necessary tool, that enemies had to be dealt with swiftly and permanently. Every betrayal he committed, every murder he ordered, was part of a larger strategy to consolidate power. But betrayal has a way of spreading, of corroding trust even among allies. As Vito tightened his grip, some of Luciano's other associates began to wonder if he was becoming too ambitious, too dangerous. He had Luciano's trust for now, but trust in the mafia was fragile. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, and the knives could turn inward. Still, Vito's position only grew stronger. He became known as a man who could make problems disappear literally. Rival gangsters who threatened the family's operations vanished. Witnesses who might testify in court suddenly forgot what they had seen. It was a time when Vito's name began to carry a chilling weight. To cross him was to sign your own death warrant. And yet, there was something cold about Vito, something that set him apart even from other gangsters. Many men in the mafia killed when they had to for business, for survival. But with Vito, there was a sense that he almost relished the efficiency of it. Violence was not emotional for him. It was simply a tool, a lever he could pull to make things move the way he wanted. This is what made him both respected and feared. Men admired his decisiveness, his willingness to do what others hesitated to do. But they also watched him carefully, knowing that today's ally could be tomorrow's target. During this time, Luciano's empire was running at full strength. Bootlegging was still profitable despite the end of prohibition, thanks to the control of nightclubs and speakeasies. Gambling and narcotics were growing industries, and the family's influence over unions meant steady streams of income. Vito oversaw much of this business with the precision of a man who saw crime not as chaos but as enterprise. Still, whispers began to circulate. Some said Vito was too ambitious, that he was already dreaming of a day when he would not just serve Luciano but replace him. Others believed he was simply doing what had to be done to protect the family. Whatever the truth, one fact was clear: Vito was consolidating power, and he was willing to cross anyone, even friends, to secure it. The more he acted, the more people feared him. And fear was exactly what he wanted. Fear kept men in line, kept them loyal, kept them from asking too many questions. Vito understood that the mafia's code of silence, omerta, was only as strong as the fear that enforced it. But fear is a double-edged sword. It can command respect, but it can also breed resentment, even hatred. Each betrayal Vito committed planted a seeds that would one day grow into threats against him. For now, though, those seeds were still hidden, still waiting for the right moment to take root. At night, when the city quieted and the neon lights buzzed faintly in the distance, Vito might have sat in a darkened room, cigar smoke curling slowly upward, thinking about the path ahead. He had removed those who stood in his way. He had shown that he was not a man to be crossed. And yet, there must have been a part of him that knew this gain could not last forever. In the mafia, power was never permanent. Even so, Vito pressed forward. The betrayals of these years were just the beginning. More would follow, bigger, bolder, and riskier. He was building toward something, though he might not yet have known exactly what. For those who watched him rise, one thing was certain: Vito Genovese was a man to fear, and fear has a way of shaping destiny. And destiny was about to take him far from New York, far from the streets that had made him. The next chapter of his life would see him leave America altogether, not by choice, but by necessity. Trouble was coming, and Vito would soon have to run. The year was 1937, and Vito Genovese's carefully constructed world was suddenly under threat. Despite his power, despite his position beside Lucky Luciano, the law was closing in. The murder of Ferdinand Boccia had not been forgotten. Investigators had been quietly working the case, piecing together evidence, turning over stones in the dark. And now, it seemed, they had enough to indict him. For a man like Vito, prison was not just a punishment, it was a death sentence, a cage that would strip him of the control he had spent his life building. He had to act fast. The decision to flee was not an easy one, but it was the only one that made sense. America had given Vito power, wealth, and influence, but it was also where the law could touch him. Italy, on the other hand, offered something else: distance, protection, and the chance to rebuild. And so, with charges hanging over his head, Vito quietly slipped away. Picture the ship that carried him back across the Atlantic, its hull cutting through the dark water as the Statue of Liberty receded into the distance. Vito must have stood on the deck for a moment, staring back at New York, the city he had conquered, the city that had made him. Perhaps there was a flicker of regret, perhaps a flash of anger. But more than anything, there was resolve. This was not the end. It was only an intermission. When Vito returned to Naples, it was like a circle closing. The narrow streets where he had once played as a child were now the streets of a man returning with money, power, and reputation. He was no longer the poor boy who had left years before. He was a man who could command respect. Naples, however, was no longer the same either. Italy was under the iron grip of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, a country where loyalty to the state was demanded and fear was a constant presence. For most men, this might have been a dangerous time to return. But for Vito, it was an opportunity. He wasted no time in building connections with local power brokers, businessmen, and even members of Mussolini's government. Money spoke loudly in fascist Italy, and Vito had plenty of it. Bribes were paid, favors exchanged, alliances forged. Soon, Vito was living in a villa outside Naples, surrounded by wealth and luxury, a man who seemed untouchable. But Vito was never one to simply sit back and enjoy comfort. He became involved in black market activities, smuggling goods, dealing in currency, and taking advantage of the chaos of a country preparing for war. When Italy entered World War II, the opportunities only grew. Food, fuel, medicine, everything became scarce, and where there is scarcity, there is profit. Vito knew how to control supply and demand, and his operations thrived. Some stories suggest that he grew close to members of Mussolini's circle, that he cultivated influence in ways that ensured his safety. It is even said that he worked as an intermediary in high-level deals, a man who could get things done when bureaucracy failed. For a time, Vito Genovese was not just surviving, he was flourishing. And yet, there was a darkness to this period of his life. Naples during the war was not a place of glamour. Bombs fell from the sky as Allied forces pushed into Italy. Buildings crumbled, civilians fled, and hunger was everywhere. In this chaos, Vito's empire grew stronger. His control of the black market meant that he could provide what others could not at a price. He became, in some ways, a king of misery, profiting from the suffering of those around him. Perhaps he justified it as business. Perhaps he told himself that he was simply filling a need. But those who remember this time often speak of Vito's cold efficiency, his ability to turn desperation into wealth without hesitation. If the streets of New York had hardened him, the streets of wartime Naples made him something even more ruthless. Still, Vito knew that Italy could not protect him forever. The war was shifting. The Allies were advancing, Mussolini's regime was crumbling, and the world was changing fast. Soon, Vito would find himself facing a new kind of threat, not from the Italian authorities, but from the Americans who had never forgotten about him. In 1944, as Allied forces liberated southern Italy, Vito was arrested by U.S. military police. It was a moment that must have felt like fate catching up with him. After years of living like a king in exile, he was suddenly in custody, facing the possibility of being sent back to the United States to stand trial for murder. And yet, luck seemed to favor him once again. Key witnesses in the Boccia case mysteriously recanted their statements or disappeared. Without them, the case fell apart. In 1945, Vito was freed. For a man who had just escaped justice for murder, it must have felt like a sign. He was unstoppable. When Vito finally boarded a ship back to America, it was with a sense of unfinished business. He had spent nearly a decade away, but his mind had never left New York. The family he had helped build was still there, and so were the rivals who had filled the power vacuum during his absence. The return of Vito Genovese would not be quiet. Perhaps, as he stood on the deck of that ship and saw the New York skyline appear on the horizon, he felt something close to triumph. He had outrun the law, outlived Mussolini's regime, survived a world war, and come back richer and more dangerous than ever. But New York had changed, too. The balance of power was not the same as when he had left. Luciano had been imprisoned and then deported to Italy, leaving Frank Costello in charge of the family. Costello was a boss who ruled with diplomacy rather than fear, a man who preferred influence over bloodshed. Vito respected him, but he also saw an opening. The man returning from Italy was no longer just a trusted lieutenant. He was a man who believed he was destined to sit at the very top. And soon, he would begin the moves that would shake the underworld to its core. The war years in Italy were a crucible, and for Vito Genovese, they were a time of both unimaginable opportunity and growing darkness. Naples, once a bustling port city, had become a place of hunger, blackouts, and fear. Bombing raids left entire blocks in ruins, rubble piled in the streets, and families huddled in makeshift shelters. At night, the sky glowed with fires from air raids, and the sound of distant artillery echoed like thunder over the bay. But for Vito, this chaos was the perfect breeding ground for power. When Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its grip on the country, everything became regulated: food, fuel, medicine, even basic supplies. Shortages were everywhere, and the black market thrived. Vito became one of the men who controlled that market. He could get what no one else could: sacks of flour, barrels of olive oil, American cigarettes, even penicillin. The people of Naples whispered his name with both gratitude and resentment. He was the man you went to when you were desperate, but you paid whatever price he asked. Imagine the scenes that played out during this time: a darkened warehouse near the port, barrels being rolled off the back of trucks under the cover of night. Men counting bundles of lira by candlelight. A line of poor families waiting quietly for scraps of food, hoping that Vito's men would take pity on them. There was a strange, almost feudal power in this arrangement. Vito had become more than a gangster. In the starving city, he was a kind of king. Some accounts suggest that Vito did more than just trade in food and supplies. He allegedly developed relationships with officials in Mussolini's government, offering money and favors to ensure his safety. He was even rumored to have befriended some of the fascist hierarchy, perhaps even Mussolini's own son-in-law, Carlo Luciano. Whether these stories are true or simply part of the legend that grew around him, they reveal something essential about Vito's mindset during these years. He believed he was untouchable. When the Allies landed in southern Italy in 1943, Vito's position shifted once again. Naples became a vital staging ground for the Allied campaign, and with the military came new opportunities. Soldiers needed food, fuel, entertainment, all things that Vito could provide, for a price. There are reports that he worked with Allied officers, offering his services as a fixer and interpreter. Some even say he helped identify collaborators and fascists, using his local knowledge to curry favor with the Americans. It was during this period that Vito's confidence hardened into arrogance. He had survived the fall of Mussolini, the German occupation, and the arrival of the Allies, and instead of being treated as a criminal, he was sometimes treated as a man who could help keep order in a volatile city. The irony must not have been lost on him. He, a wanted man back in America, was now being relied upon by the U.S. military to stabilize Naples. But this relationship with the Allies would not save him forever. In 1944, U.S. military police finally arrested Vito, acting on the outstanding murder indictment from New York. The moment must have been surreal. The man who had just spent years acting as a power broker was now a prisoner, facing the possibility of extradition. Still, luck was with him. The case against him was fragile, built largely on the testimony of witnesses who were suddenly unavailable, unwilling, or dead. One by one, the key pieces of evidence fell apart. It was as if the walls of justice crumbled just before they could close in on him. By 1945, Vito was released, the murder charge dismissed. This was a turning point in Vito's sight. Surviving that indictment confirmed what he already suspected: he was destined to rule. Fate, it seemed, was on his side. Every obstacle that had been thrown in his path had been removed, every threat neutralized. He had fled the United States under a cloud of suspicion, built an empire in a war zone, been arrested, and walked free. To Vito, it must have felt like he was invincible. And so, when he prepared to return to America, it was not as a fugitive slinking back in fear. It was as a conqueror. He had money, he had connections, and he had the cold certainty that nothing could stop him. The New York he was returning to was a city where Luciano was gone, deported after serving a prison sentence, and Frank Costello now sat at the head of the family. Costello was a different kind of boss, sophisticated, diplomatic, a man who preferred politics and influence over guns and blood. Vito respected Costello's intelligence, but he saw him as weak, too willing to compromise, too willing to deal with outsiders. Vito's time in Italy had sharpened him into something harder, something more dangerous. He had lived in a world where survival required absolute control, where hesitation could mean death. He had ruled like a dictator over Naples' black market, and now he was ready to bring that same iron hand to New York. Perhaps on the ship back to America, standing on the deck at night as the waves hissed against the hull, Vito thought of all that lay ahead. The skyline of Manhattan would soon rise before him, glittering like a promise. The family he had helped build was strong, but he wanted more than to simply be part of it. He wanted to be the man at the top, the boss, the final authority, the one whose word was law. The war years had been his crucible, and they had burned away whatever hesitation he might once have had. What stepped off that ship was not just a gangster returning home. It was a man who believed he was destined to rule the underworld, and who would stop at nothing to claim the throne. But power is a dangerous hunger. And as Vito would soon learn, the very arrogance that made him strong would also make him vulnerable. His return to New York would set off a chain of events that would shake the mafia to its core. The ship slid quietly into New York harbor, its steel hull glistening in the early morning light. For most passengers, this moment was one of relief, a return home after years of war and displacement. For Vito Genovese, it was something entirely different. This was not just a return, it was a re-entry into the game, a chance to reclaim his place in the criminal empire he had helped build. As the skyline came into view, with its towering buildings and the faint haze of smoke rising from factory chimneys, Vito must have felt a dark thrill. He had been gone nearly a decade, and yet his name still carried weight. The streets had changed, but the underworld had not forgotten him. Stepping off the ship, Vito was no longer the fugitive who had fled murder charges in 1937. He was richer, sharper, and more dangerous. The war years had given him not just survival skills, but confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from cheating death and escaping justice. He walked through the port with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do. But New York was not the same as when he had left. The Luciano crime family, which Vito had once served as underboss, was now under the control of Frank Costello. Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, was a very different kind of leader from Luciano. Where Luciano had balanced ruthlessness with vision, Costello ruled through diplomacy and political influence. He preferred bribery to bullets, backroom deals to street wars. His power base rested not just on gangsters, but on judges, cops, and politicians who could be bought and paid for. Vito respected Costello's intelligence, but deep down he viewed this style of leadership as weak. To Vito, the mafia was not meant to be polite or subtle. It was meant to be feared. And in Costello's New York, fear had begun to fade. Some in the organization even whispered that Costello was too cautious, too willing to compromise with rivals. For a man like Vito, this was an opening, an opportunity to reassert himself and to bring the family back under a rule of iron. The first step was re-establishing himself within the family. This meant quietly reconnecting with old allies, reasserting control over rackets that had fallen into other hands, and reminding everyone that Vito Genovese was back, and that he was not a man to be ignored. He moved deliberately, carefully, never rushing. He knew that too much aggression too soon would draw unnecessary attention from law enforcement and might even unite his rivals against him. Imagine the quiet meetings that took place during these months, smoke-filled rooms in backstreet social clubs, the clatter of glasses on polished wood tables, the low hum of conversation as Vito laid out his vision. He would have spoken calmly, almost softly, but with a weight that made every man in the room listen. Those who had grown comfortable under Costello's reign must have felt a chill as they realized that a new era might be coming, one where diplomacy would be replaced by the blunt language of force. Vito's return also sent ripples beyond his own family. Other mafia families watched closely, gauging whether his presence would upset the delicate balance of power. Some welcomed him back, hoping he would bring strength and unity. Others were wary, remembering his reputation for betrayal and his ambition to climb higher. Law enforcement, too, took notice. The name Vito Genovese was not forgotten in their files. Detectives who had worked the Boccia case years earlier now saw an opportunity to watch him closely, to find a new way to bring him down. But Vito was cautious. He had learned from his past mistakes and knew how to keep his hands clean. He allowed others to handle the dirty work, never putting himself too close to any crime that could be traced back to him. And yet, for all his caution, there was an intensity building within him. He had not come back to simply take orders from Costello. He wanted the top job. He believed it was his by right. He had helped create the family, helped shape the very structure of the commission itself. To take orders now, after all he had survived, must have felt intolerable. Those close to him would later say that Vito's ambition was like a fire that never went out. He spoke often of the future, of the changes he wanted to make, of how the family could be run more effectively. To his supporters, this was inspiring, a promise that the organization could become stronger, richer, more feared. To his enemies, it was a warning that trouble was coming. Still, Vito was patient. He spent months carefully maneuvering, regaining influence, building alliances. His presence alone was enough to shift the mood of the underworld. Men who had once been bold under Costello's relatively calm leadership now hesitated, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. In quiet moments, Vito must have thought about the risks. To move against a sitting boss was no small thing. If he failed, it could mean death, not just for him, but for those loyal to him. But if he succeeded, he would finally sit on the throne he had always imagined for himself. The weight of that decision must have pressed on him every night as he lay awake, the glow of the city filtering through the window, the sounds of distant traffic a reminder that the world outside never slept. By the time a year had passed since his return, Vito had positioned himself as a force to be reckoned with. He was no longer just a former underboss come home from exile. He was a contender. And everyone in New York's underworld, from the street soldiers to the highest-ranking capos, knew it. Soon, Vito would make his move. And when he did, the streets of New York would once again run with tension and blood. The calm reign of Frank Costello was about to face its greatest challenge. Vito Genovese had returned to New York not to serve but to rule. Every meeting, every quiet conversation in the back rooms of Italian cafes and social clubs was another step toward that goal. For months, he moved carefully, rebuilding his network, collecting debts both financial and personal, and reminding everyone who would listen that he had not survived exile and war just to take orders. The man who had once been Lucky Luciano's trusted underboss was now positioning himself as the rightful heir, and in his mind, nothing less than the top seat would satisfy him. Frank Costello, the reigning boss, was a man of remarkable intelligence and cunning. He had kept the Luciano crime family stable during some of its most difficult years, even as Luciano himself sat in prison and later faced deportation. Costello had forged deep ties with politicians, judges, and even police captains. his influence reached far beyond the streets. He was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld because he preferred diplomacy and bribes to bloodshed. But to men like Vito, that approach felt soft. Vito believed the family needed a boss who ruled with fear, who reminded the streets that disobedience would be met with swift, merciless consequences. In Vito's mind, Costello had become too cautious, too willing to compromise. He did not just want to share power, he wanted to replace him entirely. The plan to remove Costello was not rushed. Vito was too clever for that. First, he needed allies. He quietly reached out to capos and soldiers who were dissatisfied with Costello's leadership, men who felt they had been overlooked or underpaid, men who longed for the kind of direct, forceful rule that Vito promised. Slowly, his coalition grew. But taking power in the mafia was not a matter of simple politics. To dethrone a boss, one had to send a message, one so strong that no one would dare resist. And so, a plan was put in motion. Costello would have to be eliminated, or at the very least, frightened into stepping aside. On the evening of 2nd May 1957, Frank Costello returned home to his apartment building on Central Park West. The spring air was warm, the city alive with the sounds of traffic and conversation. Costello had no idea that a gunman was waiting. Vincent Chin Gigante, a young, loyal associate of Vito's, had been chosen for the task. The elevator doors opened, Costello stepped into the lobby, and then came the crack of a pistol. The bullet struck Costello in the head, grazing his skull, but by some miracle, it did not kill him. Stunned, bleeding, Costello managed to stagger to the elevator and escape with his life. In the hours that followed, he was rushed to the hospital, treated, and stabilized. When he emerged, reporters swarmed him, asking who had tried to kill him. Costello's answer was quiet but firm, "I forgive them." It was a remarkable response, and a telling one. Costello was no longer interested in a war for power. He had already been considering stepping back from the life, and now, with a near-death experience fresh in his mind, he decided it was time. Rather than retaliate, rather than plunge the family into a bloody conflict, he chose to retire, effectively ceding control to Vito. For Vito Genovese, this was a triumph. Without a full-scale war, without a commission intervention, he had forced Costello out and taken his place as boss. It was the culmination of years of ambition, maneuvering, and careful planning. At last, the family was his. Imagine the scene in Vito's headquarters that night, the celebration muted but heavy with satisfaction, glasses of wine raised in a quiet toast, nods exchanged around the table. Vito had done it. The man who had once been a fugitive, who had fled to Italy under threat of indictment, was now the undisputed head of what would become known as the Genovese crime family, the most powerful mafia organization in the country. But taking power was only the beginning. Vito immediately set about consolidating his control. He reorganized the family's operations, tightened discipline, and expanded into new rackets. He made it clear that loyalty was non-negotiable and that betrayal would be met with death. Men who had wavered during the transition were either brought into line or quietly removed. This was Vito at his peak, a man who commanded respect through fear, who ruled not with the careful diplomacy of Costello but with the iron hand of a true boss. The family became more secretive, more disciplined, and more dangerous. Even the commission, the ruling council of the mafia, now had to deal with Vito on his terms. And yet, even in this moment of victory, there were clouds gathering on the horizon. Vito's methods were ruthless, and ruthlessness creates enemies. Some of those enemies were outside the family, rivals who feared his growing influence. Others were within, men who had supported him but now wondered whether they had unleashed a force they could not control. Law enforcement, too, was paying close attention. The attempted hit on Costello had drawn headlines, and the authorities were eager to prove that they could bring the new boss down. FBI files began to thicken with reports on Vito's activities. Informants were questioned, wiretaps were set, and surveillance teams followed him wherever he went. But for now, Vito was untouchable. He walked the streets with quiet confidence, his dark suits pressed, his fedora tilted just so. When he entered a restaurant or club, conversations stopped, and men stood in respect. He had achieved what he had dreamed of since his early days running errands for Luciano. He was the boss. Perhaps at night, sitting alone in his home, Vito reflected on how far he had come. The boy from Naples, the street kid from Mulberry Street, the fugitive who had once run from justice, he now sat at the very top of the American underworld. It must have felt like destiny fulfilled. But power, once attained, is never safe. The same ambition that had driven Vito to the top would soon drive others to plot against him. The throne he had fought so hard to claim was never truly secure. And in the years to come, Vito would discover that betrayal cuts both ways. By 1957, Vito Genovese was at the height of his power. He had forced Frank Costello into retirement without plunging the city into an all-out gang war, and now he sat atop the most powerful crime family in America. But power always attracts attention, and Vito's ambitions didn't stop at ruling his own organization. He wanted more influence, more control, more recognition as the undisputed boss of bosses. The Mafia Commission had been designed years earlier to prevent exactly that kind of centralized authority, but Vito believed he was strong enough to bend it to his will. To solidify his position and display his dominance, he proposed a meeting, not a quiet sit-down in New York or a discreet gathering in Chicago, but a grand summit of mafia bosses from across the country. It would be the largest such gathering in history, a show of unity and power that would leave no doubt about who was in charge. The chosen location was Appalachian, a quiet little town in upstate New York. It was an unlikely place for a summit of crime lords, remote, quiet, far from the watchful eyes of the big city police. Joseph Barbera, a friendly associate with a sprawling country estate, offered to host. In November 1957, invitations were quietly sent out. Bosses and underbosses from across the country, New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, New Orleans, all were summoned. They came in Cadillacs and Lincolns, cars with polished chrome and out-of-state plates that gleamed as they pulled into the long driveway. Imagine the scene, more than 60 men, the most powerful figures in organized crime, gathering in one place. The estate buzzed with quiet conversation. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Around tables, men discussed business, narcotics trafficking, gambling interests, labor rackets. They debated how to divide territories, how to avoid conflicts, how to keep the mafia profitable in the face of growing law enforcement pressure. At the center of it all was Vito Genovese, calm, composed, every inch the Don. This was his moment, the ultimate display of his power. He had brought them all together, and by doing so, he had shown that he could command the respect of the entire underworld. But outside those walls, something was stirring. The sheer number of luxury cars rolling through the sleepy town had not gone unnoticed. Local law enforcement, state troopers, and small-town cops began to wonder what was happening at the Barbara estate. Why were so many strangers arriving? Why were they so well-dressed, so watchful, so secretive? One trooper, suspicious, decided to investigate. Soon, police cars were pulling up near the property. The alarm spread quickly inside. Word went around that the cops were here. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. The scene that followed was almost comical, though for the men involved it was deadly serious. Bosses ran for the back doors, scrambling across lawns, leaping over hedges, disappearing into the woods in their expensive shoes and tailored suits. Some dove into their cars and tried to flee down the narrow country roads, only to be stopped at police checkpoints. The police could hardly believe what they were seeing. One by one, they rounded up dozens of men, some of the most notorious names in organized crime, and brought them in for questioning. Many gave false names, but the sheer number of arrests made headlines around the country. For decades, law enforcement and the government had struggled to prove the existence of a national crime syndicate. Now, here it was, exposed in broad daylight. For the American public, the Appalachian meeting was a revelation. Newspaper front pages blared the news. Senators called for investigations. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had long downplayed the mafia's existence, could no longer deny it. The myth of an invisible, untouchable criminal network was shattered. The mafia was real, it was organized, and it was more powerful than anyone had imagined. For Vito Genovese, what should have been his crowning moment turned into a nightmare. Instead of solidifying his image as the unchallenged boss, he had drawn unwanted attention on an unprecedented scale. His efforts to unite the mafia had backfired spectacularly. In the weeks and months that followed, law enforcement pressure intensified. Wiretaps were expanded, surveillance teams were deployed, and investigations multiplied. Prosecutors began building cases against top bosses, including Vito. Informants, once too afraid to speak, now saw opportunities to cut deals. The walls were slowly beginning to close in. Inside the mafia, the fallout was just as dangerous. Some bosses blamed Vito for the disaster, accusing him of arrogance and poor judgment. They believed his ambition had brought the heat that now threatened them all. Trust began to erode. Quietly, some began to conspire against him, plotting ways to curb his power or remove him entirely. But Vito was not a man to show fear. Outwardly, he remained calm, conducting business as if nothing had happened. He tightened his grip on the family, demanding loyalty, silencing dissent. Yet those closest to him could sense a shift. He had become more watchful, more suspicious, more prone to see betrayal in every shadow. The Appalachian meeting marked a turning point not just for Vito but for organized crime as a whole. The era of quiet invisibility was over. The mafia was now a target, and its leaders were under a microscope. For Vito, the consequences were personal. The man who had once believed himself untouchable was now facing a future in which every move was watched, every conversation potentially recorded, every ally potentially an informant. Still, he was not ready to surrender. If anything, the exposure of Appalachian hardened him. He would fight to hold on to his throne, to keep the power he had spent a lifetime chasing. But the forces gathering against him were relentless. And soon, Vito Genovese would face the one battle he could not win, a battle not in the streets, but in the courts. After Appalachian, the world seemed to grow smaller around Vito Genovese. He was still the boss, still one of the most feared men in America, but something had shifted. The summit that was meant to solidify his position had instead thrown the mafia into the brightest spotlight it had ever seen. Law enforcement pressure mounted, journalists wrote endless stories about organized crime, and the FBI, once reluctant to admit the mafia even existed, now made it a priority to dismantle it. For Vito, this was more than just a public relations problem. It was a direct threat to his power, to the very empire he had spent his life building. And so he tightened his grip. The Genovese family, under his rule, became a fortress. Meetings were more secretive than ever. Soldiers and capos were warned to keep their mouths shut, to avoid unnecessary attention, to follow orders without question. Vito's word was law, and he made sure everyone knew it. Those who were suspected of talking to law enforcement, or even of being disloyal, often disappeared. Their absence sent a chilling message: betrayal would not be tolerated. But even as he consolidated his power, paranoia began to creep in. Vito had always been careful, always a man who trusted very few. Now, he trusted almost no one. He began to suspect plots everywhere, among rival bosses, among his own lieutenants, even among those who had once been closest to him. The stress of leadership, combined with the heat of constant surveillance, weighed heavily on him. Imagine him sitting in his headquarters late at night, the room dim except for a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. A cigar glows faintly between his fingers, smoke curling toward the ceiling. On the desk in front of him are reports from his capos: who has paid, who has failed, who has been seen talking to the wrong people. Each name, each rumor is weighed carefully, the way a judge weighs evidence before passing sentence. This was Vito at the peak of his power, and perhaps also at his most dangerous. He could order a murder with a single nod, and it would be carried out without hesitation. His reach extended into labor unions, gambling operations, narcotics networks, and legitimate businesses. He had influence in City Hall, in police departments, even in courtrooms. And yet, there was a sense that the world was closing in. The newspapers were full of stories about the mafia, and Vito's name was often front and center. He hated publicity. To him, power was meant to be quiet, invisible, like a hand moving the pieces on a chessboard. Now, with every headline, with every photograph of him in handcuffs or stepping out of a courthouse, the mystique of invisibility was slipping away. Inside the family, Vito's paranoia began to affect the way business was conducted. Decisions that once might have been delegated now required his direct approval. He became more controlling, more involved in every detail. Some of his lieutenants resented this, whispering that the boss no longer trusted them. Others grew afraid, knowing that a single misstep could lead to fatal consequences. The pressure from law enforcement was relentless. Agents followed him, tails parked outside his home and office, listening to every move. Wiretaps caught snatches of conversation, enough to build cases but not enough to put him away, not yet. Each raid, each subpoena, each grand jury summons was like a drumbeat, a slow reminder that time was running out. Vito responded in the only way he knew how, by pushing harder. He expanded the family's narcotics operations, seeing heroin as one of the most lucrative businesses available. Despite the risks, despite the heat, he wanted the money and the power that came with controlling the drug trade. This decision would prove to be one of the most fateful of his life. Among the men closest to him, there were some who began to quietly turn against him. Not openly, no one dared challenge Vito face to face, but behind the scenes, alliances were shifting. Some were tired of the constant scrutiny, the constant fear. Others simply saw an opportunity to remove a boss whose ambition was now threatening the survival of the entire organization. For the moment, though, Vito remained untouchable. He attended weddings, baptisms, and dinners, appearing calm, even charming. To outsiders, he was simply a businessman, a man of culture who dressed impeccably and spoke with quiet authority. But those who knew him best could see the edge beneath the surface, the watchful look in his eyes, the way he seemed to measure every word, every gesture. In these years, Vito must have felt both invincible and vulnerable at the same time, a paradox that defined his reign. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted. He was the boss, the man at the top of the pyramid. But he could also sense that this position came with a price, and that price was growing heavier with each passing day. At night, perhaps lying awake while the city outside grew quiet, he must have wondered how long it could last. How long before one of his enemies struck? How long before the government found a way to put him away for good? How long before one of the men he trusted most decided that loyalty was no longer worth the risk? For now, though, the empire still stood. The Genovese family was feared, respected, and powerful. Vito's name was enough to make men pause, to make them think twice before crossing him. But power is a dangerous drug, and Vito had been using it for a long time. The more he had, the more he wanted, and the more he tightened his grip, the more cracks began to appear. Soon, those cracks would widen into fissures. And when they did, they would bring Vito face to face with the one enemy he could not outwit, bribe, or silence, the federal government. The decision to move deeper into narcotics trafficking was, in many ways, the turning point of Vito Genovese's reign. He had always been ambitious, always hungry for more, but this move was different. Gambling, extortion, loan sharking, these were old mafia rackets, respectable in the sense that they were part of the life's tradition. Narcotics, on the other hand, were dangerous. They brought immense profits, yes, but also intense scrutiny from law enforcement. Even within the mafia, there were men who believed dealing drugs was too risky, too likely to draw the full weight of the government. But Vito was not a man easily swayed by caution. The profits were too great to ignore. Heroin was flowing in from Europe and the Middle East, and Vito wanted control of that pipeline. With his international connections from his years in Italy, he was perfectly positioned to build a network that could bring drugs into the United States and distribute them across major cities. Imagine the quiet meetings in dimly lit apartments and back rooms, maps and shipping manifests spread out on tables, men discussing routes and couriers in hushed voices. This was not street-level dealing, this was a sophisticated operation involving importers, distributors, and corrupt officials. Every brick of heroin meant thousands of dollars in profit, and those dollars meant more power. At first, the strategy worked brilliantly. The Genovese family's wealth grew, and Vito's grip on the underworld tightened. But the very success of the narcotics business brought new attention. Federal agencies had long been trying to connect the mafia to the drug trade, and now they had a reason to focus all their resources on the man at the top. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, made Vito one of its primary targets. Agents began watching every move, planting informants wherever they could. Wiretaps bust with snippets of conversation. Slowly, patiently, the government built its case. It was not just about catching street dealers. It was about tying the entire network back to Vito himself. Inside the family, there were murmurs of discontent. Some capos felt that Vito's obsession with narcotics was reckless, that it endangered all of them. Others were quietly resentful, feeling they were not getting their fair share of the profits. And somewhere in those ranks, someone began to talk. The federal sting operation that followed was methodical. Undercover agents made buys, flipped low-level dealers, and followed the chain upward. Each arrest brought new information, and piece by piece, the net closed around Vito. When the indictment finally came in 1958, it was devastating. Vito Genovese, the boss of the most powerful mafia family in America, was charged with conspiracy to traffic narcotics. The trial that followed was front-page news. Vito appeared calm, even defiant, as he entered the courtroom each day, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. He denied everything, of course. To admit involvement in narcotics would have been both a legal and an underworld death sentence. The mafia's own code technically forbade drug dealing, even though many secretly profited from it. But the government had witnesses, and some of them had once been Vito's men. They testified about meetings, about shipments, about orders they said came directly from the boss. Some claimed they had been present when Vito personally approved deals. The evidence piled up, and though Vito's lawyers fought hard, the tide was against him. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, the verdict was guilty. Vito was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. For a man who had once seemed untouchable, it was a staggering blow. When the sentence was read, Vito did not break down or lash out. He simply nodded, as if accepting what he already knew was inevitable. The federal government had finally done what his rivals and enemies could not. They had taken him off the streets. Yet even as he was led away in handcuffs, there was something in Vito's demeanor that suggested he was not finished. He had built his empire through cunning and fear, and he had no intention of relinquishing it simply because he was behind bars. The narcotics conviction marked the beginning of the end for Vito Genovese, but it was not yet the end itself. Even from prison, he would find ways to wield power, to issue orders, to influence the family that still bore his name. But the arrest had changed everything. The man who had once ruled the streets now ruled from a cell. The fear he inspired was still there, but it was tinged with something else, the quiet realization that even the most powerful Don could be brought down. And somewhere, perhaps lying awake on his prison cot, Vito must have wondered how it had come to this. He had fought, schemed, and killed to sit on the throne of the underworld, only to find himself caged, his empire under siege, and the world outside changing faster than he could control. But Vito was not a man to give up easily. The walls might have closed around him, but as long as he could speak, as long as he could send messages, he believed he could still rule. The trial of Vito Genovese was not just another criminal proceeding, it was a spectacle. For years, law enforcement had struggled to connect the dots between the mafia's bosses and the crimes committed in their names. Now, in a packed federal courtroom, the government would try to prove that the most powerful Don in America had personally orchestrated a massive narcotics conspiracy. The world watched as Vito, dressed immaculately in dark, tailored suits, walked calmly past reporters, ignoring their shouted questions as flashbulbs lit up the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom was tense, buzzing with anticipation. Federal prosecutors were determined to make an example of Vito. Their case was carefully constructed, built on months of surveillance, undercover work, and witness testimony. They presented him not as a distant businessman, but as the mastermind of an international heroin pipeline that stretched from Europe to the streets of New York. Vito sat quietly at the defense table, his expression almost serene. He did not fidget, did not scowl. Instead, he exuded an air of calm authority, as if the trial was just another business meeting and he was patiently waiting for it to end. His lawyers worked tirelessly, cross-examining witnesses, challenging evidence, and arguing that the government's case relied on the words of criminals who were themselves trying to save their own skins. But the witnesses were compelling. One after another, former associates took the stand, some reluctantly, some defiantly, pointing at Vito and recounting conversations, orders, and meetings. They described shipments being approved, money being counted, couriers being dispatched. The jury listened intently, the image of the quiet, composed man at the table slowly transforming in their minds into that of a ruthless puppet master. The prosecution emphasized the scale of the operation: heroin smuggled through ports, processed and distributed on a massive scale, poisoning neighborhoods and filling the family's coffers with millions of dollars. They argued that this was not the work of rogue street dealers, but a coordinated enterprise led from the very top by Vito Genovese himself. Defense attorneys fought back hard, calling character witnesses, highlighting the lack of direct physical evidence and reminding the jury that cooperating witnesses had everything to gain by lying. But the tide was difficult to turn. The courtroom air grew heavier with each passing day, as if everyone present knew which way the verdict was leaning. Through it all, Vito remained composed. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. Reporters noted the contrast between his polite demeanor and the chilling allegations being read aloud. It was as though Vito was determined to show the world that he could not be broken, that even with the government arrayed against him, he would maintain his dignity. When closing arguments ended, the courtroom fell into a hush. The jury deliberated, hours turning into days. Outside, reporters waited, their columns half-written, ready for the word that would decide the fate of one of the most powerful criminals in American history. At last, the jury returned. The verdict: guilty. The sentence was harsh, 15 years in federal prison. For a man who had built an empire on fear, loyalty, and precision, it was a devastating blow. Yet Vito did not react with anger or outburst. He simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that the move on the chessboard had been made and that the game would continue from here. As marshals placed handcuffs on him and led him away, photographers captured the moment, the once untouchable Don now walking through the halls of justice, a prisoner like any other. The image was splashed across newspapers nationwide, proof that the government could bring down even the most powerful mafia boss. But Vito's story did not end at the courthouse steps. Even from prison, he retained influence. Messages still flowed out through visiting lawyers, loyal associates, and coded communications. Murders were ordered, disputes settled, money collected, all under Vito's watchful eye. To those on the outside, it was clear that the boss might be physically behind bars, but his mind and his will still controlled the family. The trial, however, had changed the public perception of the mafia forever. Before Appalachian and before this case, many Americans still thought of organized crime as a collection of small-time gangs and colorful characters. Now they understood it was a nationwide syndicate with corporate-like structure and a man like Vito at its head. For the Genovese family, the conviction brought both stability and danger. Stability, because there was no longer any doubt who the boss was. Vito's authority was cemented by the fact that even in prison, he continued to lead. Danger, because law enforcement pressure did not let up. The family became one of the most closely watched organizations in the country, and every move they made was scrutinized. For Vito personally, the trial was a turning point, a moment when the myth of his invincibility was finally pierced. And yet, there was something almost defiant about the way he carried himself in those final days of freedom. He had spent decades building toward this position. If the price of being the boss was prison, then he seemed willing to pay it. At night, in his cell, perhaps he would sit on his bunk and think about the courtroom, the jurors' faces as the verdict was read, the gavel striking wood, the sound of chains clicking shut. He had outlived Masseria, outmaneuvered Marangiano, forced Costello into retirement, and seized the throne he had always coveted. If this was the cost, then so be it. The trial had ended with a gavel, but the game was far from over. From within the walls of a federal prison, Vito Genovese would continue to pull strings, to punish his enemies, and to remind everyone that though he was confined, he was still the Don. Prison, for most men, is the end of power. It is a place where time moves slowly, where days bleed into one another, and where the outside world forgets your name. But for Vito Genovese, prison was not the end, it was merely a new office, one with bars instead of walls. From the moment he arrived, Vito set about turning his confinement into a command center. He was sent to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, a fortress of grey stone and iron that housed some of the country's most dangerous men. But Vito was not just another inmate. He carried with him the reputation of a boss, and with that reputation came both respect and fear. Fellow prisoners gave him space, guards treated him with very caution, and even behind bars, his influence began to grow. Vito quickly established a network inside. Trusted messengers, lawyers, relatives, and loyal soldiers visited regularly. Through them, he sent orders back to New York. Murders were still carried out, debts still collected, disputes still settled. The family's operations continued almost as if he were still on the streets. If anything, some capos became even more loyal, impressed by his ability to maintain control despite his incarceration. Imagine Vito in his cell late at night, seated at the small metal desk provided by the prison, writing letters in a neat, deliberate hand. These were not ordinary letters, they were coded, carefully phrased so that even if intercepted, their meaning would remain hidden. Each one was a directive: who should be promoted, who should be disciplined, which rackets should be expanded, which rivals should be eliminated. These letters, smuggled out through intermediaries, became the lifeline of the Genovese family. Even within the prison walls, Vito wielded power. He made allies among other inmates, sometimes offering protection, sometimes offering favors that could be delivered through his outside network. He cultivated relationships with certain guards, ensuring that life behind bars was as comfortable as it could be. Some stories suggest that he lived better than most prisoners, receiving special food, enjoying privileges quietly granted in exchange for money or influence. But ruling from prison was not without challenges. Communication was slower, decisions took longer to implement, and rivals on the outside sometimes saw his confinement as an opportunity to advance their own ambitions. Vito responded to this with calculated ruthlessness. whenever a challenge to his authority appeared, it was crushed. Those suspected of betrayal were found dead, sometimes in very public ways, a grim reminder that Vito's reach extended far beyond the prison gates. The psychological effect of this was enormous. Within the mafia, no one doubted that Vito remained in charge. He had become something more than a man. He was a symbol, a reminder that the boss was the boss no matter where he was physically located. His word, carried on scraps of paper and whispered through visitors, still shaped the future of the family. And yet, behind the facade of control, the isolation of prison must have weighed on him. For a man who had once walked into restaurants and watched entire rooms fall silent, to now live under constant supervision, surrounded by locked doors, must have been a constant reminder of what he had lost. There were moments of vulnerability. Some inmates recalled seeing Vito alone, staring at the wall or sitting quietly in the yard, lost in thought. Perhaps he was remembering Naples, or the streets of New York, or the days when he and Lucky Luciano had dreamed of a new kind of mafia. Perhaps he was wondering whether all the blood and betrayal had truly been worth it. Still, Vito never allowed weakness to show in front of others. When visitors came, he sat upright, impeccably dressed in prison-issue clothes pressed to perfection, speaking softly but with authority. He gave orders, listened to reports, and made decisions as if he were still sitting at the head of the table. For the men running the family on the outside, this was both reassuring and intimidating. Reassuring because they knew they were still following the will of their boss. Intimidating because it meant there was no escape from his scrutiny. Even from a cell, Vito could decide their fate. But prison also created opportunities for his enemies. The other crime families, as well as ambitious underbosses within his own, began to quietly maneuver, positioning themselves for the day when Vito would no longer be able to rule. Some waited patiently, others plotted more actively, whispering in corners, considering whether it was time for a change. As the years passed, Vito aged. His once dark hair turned grey, his features hardened by time and confinement. His health began to decline, though he tried to keep this hidden. He still exercised, still walked the yard, still projected strength. But the reality was that the man, who had once been unstoppable, was now fighting battles not just against the government but against his own body. In those long, quiet nights in his cell, he must have felt the weight of it all, the years, the losses, the betrayals. And yet, he refused to let go of power. To Vito, surrender was unthinkable. He had climbed too far, sacrificed too much, to simply step aside. For the Genovese family, these were strange years. Their boss was both absent and present, distant yet omnipresent. His shadow loomed over every decision, his name invoked in every meeting. Even as the outside world changed, as law enforcement grew more sophisticated, as new generations of gangsters rose, the old Don held on. But no man, not even one as determined as Vito Genovese, can hold power forever. Age, illness, and the shifting tides of loyalty were beginning to erode his grip. The man who had ruled through fear would soon find that fear alone could not protect him from the inevitable. In the end, it was not the government, not a rival family, and not even a hitman's bullet that began to undo Vito Genovese. It was time and betrayal. The same force he had used so many times to rise to power now turned against him. Slowly, silently, the cracks in his empire began to widen. Whispers started to circulate within the prison walls and outside among the family. Some said Vito was losing his edge. Others claimed he had grown paranoid and unpredictable, making decisions that hurt business rather than strengthened it. Age was catching up with him. The once razor-sharp mind that had navigated wars, betrayals, and power plays now sometimes faltered. He had built his kingdom on fear, but fear can only hold men for so long. And then came the rumors, dark, unsettling rumors, that Vito had been poisoned. Some say it happened in the prison mess hall, others that it was slipped into his drink during a meeting with visitors. The truth remains murky, but what is certain is that Vito's health began to fail rapidly and mysteriously. Once a strong and imposing figure even in old age, he now grew thin, pale, and frail. His body betrayed him in a way no rival ever had. Imagine him in those final months in the Atlanta penitentiary, sitting alone on his bunk, his hands shaking slightly as he held a cigarette. The man who had once inspired fear with just a look now struggled to walk across the prison yard. Fellow inmates noticed the change. Guards noticed. Even visitors left with a quiet, unspoken sadness. The boss was fading. The poisoning theory was never proven, but to those who had known Vito's ruthlessness, it was entirely believable. He had made countless enemies over the decades, men whose brothers, fathers, and friends had been ordered dead by Vito's command. Some of those enemies had lived long enough to see him imprisoned, and some may have decided that simply watching him grow old behind bars was not enough punishment. Inside the family, the erosion of Vito's power accelerated. His orders carried less weight, sometimes ignored or altered by those on the outside who were now more focused on their own survival and profits. The men who had once feared him began to see an opportunity to reshape the family in their own image. The Genovese organization was too powerful to collapse, but it was changing, adapting, moving beyond its aging boss. This was perhaps the cruelest betrayal of all for Vito. Not a single gunshot, not a bloody coup, but a slow drifting away of loyalty. The very thing he had built his life upon, control, was slipping through his fingers. The paranoia that had always been a part of him now consumed him. He suspected everyone. He suspected guards, visitors, even some of his most trusted men. He demanded answers, demanded action, but there was only so much he could do from behind bars. The prison cell that had once been his throne now felt more like a tomb. At night, as the cell block grew quiet, and the only sounds were the distant footsteps of guards and the faint clank of steel doors, Vito must have thought back to the days when his word was law, when he could change the course of a man's life with a single gesture. Now, those gestures meant less and less. Outside the prison walls, the underworld was changing. A younger generation of gangsters was rising, men who had never fought in the Castellameres War, who did not remember Masseria or Marangiano, who saw Vito not as a legendary boss but as a relic from another time. They respected his name, but they no longer feared him the way men once had. Even the commission, the governing body of the mafia, began to shift its focus. With Vito weakened and imprisoned, other bosses stepped forward, filling the vacuum he left behind. Decisions were made without him, alliances formed without his input. For the first time since he had seized power, Vito Genovese was no longer the central figure in the mafia world. The once mighty Don was now a shadow of himself, physically weakened, politically sidelined, and surrounded by ghosts. The faces of those he had betrayed must have haunted him: Ferdinand Boccia, Joe Masseria, Salvatore Marangiano, and countless others. The betrayals he had committed to rise to power now echoed back to him, one after another, like footsteps in a long, empty corridor. Still, Vito refused to admit defeat. He continued to issue orders, continued to play the role of boss as best he could, even as his body and his influence failed him. To let go would have been to admit that everything he had fought for, everything he had killed for, was slipping away. But deep down, he must have known. Each day brought him closer to the inevitable, and each day his world grew smaller. The prison that had once been his command post was now just a waiting room. In those final months, there was a somber dignity to Vito's decline. He had ruled with fear, but he faced his own end with a kind of grim acceptance. Perhaps he understood that this was the way of all men who seek power, that eventually, power consumes them, leaving only the memories of what once was. The betrayal that had once been his greatest weapon had now turned against him, and there was no one left to save him. The final days of Vito Genovese's life unfolded in a way that was almost eerily quiet, as if the noise of decades of power, betrayal, and bloodshed had finally faded into silence. By 1969, Vito was 71 years old and had spent much of the past decade behind bars. His health had been failing steadily for years, heart problems, internal complications, and the mysterious decline many believed was the result of slow poisoning. The man who had once walked the streets of New York with unshakable confidence was now a frail figure, a shadow of the dawn who had once inspired fear in every corner of the underworld. Inside the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where he had been transferred for treatment, the atmosphere was clinical and subdued. Gone were the bustling backrooms of Italian restaurants, the smoky clubs, the whispered conferences of capos. Here there were only sterile white walls, the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of footsteps echoing down long corridors. Vito's days had become a series of routines. Breakfast in the cafeteria if his health allowed, then time in his hospital ward bed reading newspapers or staring out the narrow window at the grey sky. He still received visitors, loyal lieutenants, lawyers, family members, but these meetings had grown fewer. The visitors who came often found him quieter, speaking less, though his mind was still sharp enough to ask questions about the family, about business, about who was rising and who was falling in the world outside. Even in these final days, Vito clung to the idea that he was still the boss. His orders carried less force than they once had, but he gave them nonetheless, refusing to relinquish the mantle of power. To stop would have been to admit defeat, and Vito was not a man who admitted defeat easily. But death was approaching, and it came not with the violence that had marked so many moments of his life, but with a slow inevitability. His body had grown too weak to keep fighting. Some days, even sitting up in bed was a struggle. Nurses recalled how he would wave them off at times, refusing pity, refusing to be treated like a helpless old man. There was a certain pride, even defiance, in the way he faced his decline. On the morning of 14th February 1969, Valentine's Day, Vito Genovese died quietly in his hospital bed. There were no gunshots, no betrayals in that final moment, only the quiet sigh of a man whose time had finally run out. The death of one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history was marked not by chaos but by stillness. The news spread quickly through the underworld. In New York, in New Jersey, in Chicago, men who had once feared Vito heard the news and nodded in silence. Some said prayers, some poured drinks in his memory, and some simply smiled, knowing that the man who had ordered so many deaths had finally met the one fate no man can escape. For the Genovese family, his passing marked the end of an era. The family that bore his name would go on, but it would never again be led by the man who had shaped it with such a ruthless hand. New leaders would rise, power would shift, but the shadow of Vito Genovese would always linger over the organization. Imagine the funeral, simple, quiet, and watched closely by law enforcement. Federal agents took note of who attended, of which underbosses and capos paid their respects, of which rivals sent flowers. The ceremony was not the grand spectacle of a king's burial, but there was a certain gravity to it. Even in death, Vito commanded attention. For those who had known him, there must have been a strange mixture of feelings, respect for the man's cunning and leadership, fear of the memory of his cruelty, and perhaps a measure of relief that his reign had finally ended. In the prison, where Vito had spent his last years, the news was met with a quiet acknowledgement. Some inmates spoke of him with awe, the boss. They called him, even after death, while others whispered of karma, of justice finally served. And somewhere, perhaps in the silence of that hospital ward after the body had been taken away, the echo of Vito's life still lingered, the deals made, the betrayals committed, the empire built and lost. The boy from Naples who had once stared at the New York skyline dreaming of power had taken that dream as far as it could go. The world outside moved on quickly, as it always does. New bosses stepped into the vacuum, new wars were fought, new alliances formed. But Vito's story remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, no matter how great, is fleeting. At night, when the city grew quiet, some old-timers would still tell stories about him. They would speak of his cunning, his ambition, and the way he had changed the mafia forever. They would speak, too, of his downfall, how betrayal, paranoia, and fate had finally brought him low. And then the room would grow quiet for a moment, as if everyone present was thinking the same thing, that no man, not even one as powerful as Vito Genovese, could escape the end that waits for all of us. The death of Vito Genovese marked more than just the end of a man's life, it marked the end of an era. When the news spread through the underworld that the boss had died quietly in a federal prison hospital, there was no dramatic upheaval, no war for control. Instead, there was a subtle shift, as if the entire structure of organized crime simply exhaled and began to move forward without him. The Genovese family, the organization that bore his name, did not crumble. In fact, in many ways it grew stronger. Unlike other mafia families that descended into bloody succession battles when a boss was killed or imprisoned, the Genovese family had been prepared. Vito, despite his failing health, had spent his last years ensuring that a line of succession was in place. Leadership passed smoothly to new hands, first to acting bosses, then to others who would rise in the years to come. This careful planning was one of Vito's final acts of control. Even in death, he refused to leave chaos behind. His desire for order, for the family to remain powerful and feared, was honored by those who followed him. The Genovese crime family became known as the Ivy League of the Mafia, the most secretive, disciplined, and structured of all the 5 families of New York. This was Vito's legacy, a criminal organization built to outlast any single man, even himself. But there was another legacy, one whispered in backrooms and in low voices. Vito had been a man of immense power, yes, but also a man of immense paranoia. His betrayals were remembered, his ruthlessness studied. Young gangsters coming up in the life were told his story not just as a tale of ambition and triumph, but as a warning. He had reached the pinnacle of power, but at a cost so great it left him isolated, feared even by those closest to him, and ultimately imprisoned until death. Imagine those smoky social clubs in Little Italy in the years after his death. The older men sit at tables, sipping espresso, talking about the old days. Vito was a boss, one might say with a shake of the head. He did what had to be done. Another might lean closer, lowering his voice, and add, but he trusted no one, and in the end, no one trusted him. Law enforcement, too, saw Vito's death as a turning point. His conviction and imprisonment had been a major victory for federal agencies, proof that the government could bring down even the most powerful mafia boss. In the years that followed, they built on that success, using new tools, electronic surveillance, undercover operations, and later the RICO Act to dismantle organized crime piece by piece. For the underworld, this meant that the age of public, flamboyant dons was over. Future bosses would become more careful, more hidden, preferring to operate from the shadows. They had seen what happened to Vito when the spotlight found him. They had seen how Appalachian and the drug trial had turned him into a target. They would not make the same mistake. And yet, there was a strange respect for Vito's name that endured. Even as younger generations of gangsters rose, they looked to his story as a kind of blueprint both for what to do and what not to do. His ability to seize power, to maneuver politically, to command fear with a single look, these were qualities admired by those who dreamed of running a family. But his arrogance, his insistence on centralizing too much power, and his willingness to expose the entire organization to unnecessary risk were remembered as cautionary lessons. In the neighborhoods he once controlled, life went on. The rackets continued, the money flowed, and the name Genovese was still spoken with respect. But the man himself had become almost mythic, his story retold with a mixture of awe and dread. Some said he had been poisoned by his own men. Others insisted that fate, not treachery, had taken him. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: Vito Genovese had left the stage, and the family moved on. In a way, this was exactly what he would have wanted. Vito was not a man who believed in sentimentality. He believed in strength, in continuity, in the idea that the family must survive no matter what happened to any single member, even the boss. Still, there must have been some who mourned him in private, who remembered him not just as a ruthless don but as a man who had once been a boy from Naples, who had crossed an ocean chasing a dream, who had clawed his way to the top through cunning and sheer will. His story was tragic in its own way, a reminder that even kings can be prisoners of their own ambition. As the years passed, the world changed. The mafia faced new challenges: federal crackdowns, internal betrayals, shifting economies. But the Genovese family remained one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. And through it all, the ghost of Vito Genovese seemed to linger, as if watching to make sure that the empire he had built was still intact. In the quiet moments, when the night was still, and the city lights glowed softly in the distance, perhaps some of the old-timers would raise a glass in his memory. Not out of love, not even out of loyalty, but out of respect for the man who had shaped their world, for better and for worse. Vito Genovese's name still lingers like smoke in the annals of organized crime, a mixture of fact and legend that can be hard to separate. Even decades after his death, people debate who he really was. Was he the ruthless betrayer who brought unnecessary attention to the mafia, or the visionary who helped turn it into the powerful, disciplined organization that survived long after he was gone? Was he a leader who thought beyond petty street wars, or a man who simply could not resist, grasping for more power until it destroyed him? The myth of Vito is powerful. In this version of the story, he was the ultimate don, cold, calculating, unshakable. The man who ordered the hits that ended the Castellammare War, who stood beside Lucky Luciano as the modern mafia was born, who dared to push Frank Costello aside and claim the throne. This myth paints him as a figure of destiny, a man whose rise was inevitable, whose control was absolute. To those who admire him, he was the embodiment of what it meant to be a boss, feared, respected, and obeyed without question. But the reality was far more complicated. Vito was brilliant, yes, but he was also reckless. His hunger for power made him careless in ways that contradicted the mafia's code of secrecy. The Appalachian meeting, his bold attempt to assert himself as the boss of bosses, was a disaster that shattered the mafia's invisibility and brought a level of law enforcement scrutiny no one had ever seen before. His move into narcotics trafficking, while immensely profitable, was viewed by many in the underworld as a dangerous mistake, one that would ultimately lead to his downfall. To understand Vito, one must look beyond the headlines and the folklore and see the man himself. He was not simply a villain nor a hero. He was a man shaped by poverty, by immigration, by the brutal streets of early 20th century New York. The lessons he learned as a boy, that survival required strength, that respect had to be earned and defended, that betrayal must be met with swift punishment, never left him. They became the code by which he lived, for better and for worse. Picture him in the prime of his life, walking through the streets of Little Italy. The shopkeepers nodding respectfully, the young men watching him with a mixture of fear and admiration, the sense that here was a man who controlled his world completely. That image is part of the myth, the boss who seemed untouchable, who seemed larger than life. But behind that image was a man who, like anyone else, had to wrestle with doubt, with danger, with the constant knowledge that one bullet could end it all. Some historians argue that Vito's betrayal of Costello was the moment that set the mafia on a darker, more violent path. Costello had favored subtlety, political influence, and compromise, while Vito believed in force and domination. By removing Costello, Vito shifted the balance back toward fear as the foundation of power. In doing so, he may have made the mafia stronger in the short term, but he also made it more vulnerable to law enforcement attention. Others see him as a visionary, a man who understood that the mafia needed discipline and structure to survive. His insistence on loyalty, on secrecy, on careful organization helped shape the Genovese family into what it would become, a criminal powerhouse so well organized that it remained strong even after his imprisonment and death. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these two extremes. Vito Genovese was both brilliant and flawed, both a builder and a destroyer. He built an empire, but he also sowed the seeds of its greatest challenges. He united men under his banner, but he also created enemies who waited patiently for their chance to strike. The myth of Vito is seductive because it is so dramatic. The boy from Naples who rose to rule the underworld, who betrayed his friends, who outlived his enemies, who died in a prison hospital far from the streets where he once held court. It is the story of ambition, of power, of the price one pays for reaching too high. And yet, when you strip away the myth, what remains is a man who was driven, who was cunning, who was often ruthless, but who was also human. A man who had to live with the consequences of his choices, who had to carry the weight of the betrayals he committed, who had to sit alone in a cell at night and face the reality that even he could not escape the walls closing in. In the quiet hours, when the city sleeps and the world seems far away, it is perhaps easier to see Vito for what he truly was. Not just a boss, not just a criminal, but a man caught between the desire to control his destiny and the inevitability of fate. His story reminds us that power is always fleeting, that no empire lasts forever, and that every man, no matter how feared, must one day answer to something greater than himself. This is why his name endures. Because Vito Genovese is more than just a chapter in mafia history, he is a symbol of ambition, of the heights it can take us to, and the depths to which it can drag us. His myth and his reality are forever intertwined. A cautionary tale and a legend all at once. And so, as the story of Vito Genovese reaches its end, we are left with a quiet image. The man who once ruled the streets of New York with an iron hand, who made and unmade bosses, who commanded respect and fear with a single glance, died far from the neighborhoods he once controlled, in a sterile prison hospital bed on a grey February morning. There were no parades, no grand farewells, no final acts of vengeance or victory, only silence. It is in that silence that the lesson of Vito's life truly reveals itself. For all the power he amassed, for all the blood spilled in his name, for all the wealth he gathered, he could not escape the fate that waits for every man. The cell door closed behind him, and the world kept turning. His empire continued without him, proving that even a man as feared as Vito Genovese could be replaced. Yet his story lingers. Perhaps it is because there is something universal about it, the story of a man who wanted more than what life first offered him, who refused to accept the hand he was dealt, who clawed his way upward no matter the cost. In that sense, Vito represents a darker reflection of ambition itself. He reminds us that the hunger for control can be both a driving force and a consuming fire. Imagine, for a moment, the streets of Little Italy at night, long after Vito is gone. The air smells faintly of espresso and fresh bread from late-night bakeries. The neon lights flicker softly above old storefronts, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Somewhere, in a quiet social club, older men sit together, playing cards, smoking cigars, and telling stories of the past. When Vito's name comes up, there is a pause, a respectful silence, perhaps tinged with fear even after all these years. They speak of him in hushed voices, remembering the man who could change a life with a single order, who could turn friends into ghosts with just a nod. But then the conversation moves on, because life always does. New bosses have risen, new wars have been fought, new deals made. The underworld Vito helped shape has evolved, but the echo of his choices remains. The commission he helped strengthen still guides the mafia. The family that bears his name remains one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. In that way, Vito's presence still lingers, like a shadow that stretches far beyond the grave. For the listener, for the one hearing this story late at night, there is something haunting about that legacy. It invites reflection. What is the true price of power? What does it mean to reach the top, only to find yourself alone, besieged, betrayed? Vito's life was a series of victories, but also a series of sacrifices, friends, allies, even his own peace of mind. Each betrayal he committed cut away another piece of his soul until, at the end, there was little left but the title of boss and the prison walls around him. And yet, there is something undeniably captivating about his journey. He was not a man who lived quietly or cautiously. He dared, he fought, he shaped history with his decisions. Whether one sees him as a villain or a visionary, there is no denying that he left a mark. The history of organized crime cannot be told without his name, and the lessons of his life cannot be ignored. As you settle deeper into the quiet of the night, let this story become a gentle reminder that even the most powerful figures are mortal, that even the most carefully built empires are fragile. Power may protect you for a time, but it is never permanent. In the end, what remains are the choices we make, the lives we touch, and the shadows we leave behind. Close your eyes and picture the final image, a man once feared across continents now lying in stillness, the sound of distant footsteps in a prison corridor fading away. The world outside continues on, the traffic of New York still roars, the lights still shine, the streets still whisper with new deals and new betrayals, but Vito is gone. His story has ended, leaving behind not just a legacy of crime but a meditation on the cost of ambition. Let that image settle like the last note of a long symphony, the final chord fading into quiet. The tale of Vito Genovese is not just a gangster story. It is a story of rise and fall, of strength and fragility, of how far a man will go to shape his destiny, and of how even the most feared man must eventually face the one enemy he cannot defeat. And now, as you listen in the stillness, you can allow the weight of this story to drift away. The streets grow silent. The city sleeps. And somewhere, perhaps in the echoes of history, the ghost of Vito Genovese walks one last time through the shadows before fading into the night.